You hear it before you see anything. A rising howl thin at first, then sharper, louder, almost painful. Soldiers on the front say, that sound alone can freeze your blood. It belongs to one weapon, the Katyusha M13, the Soviet multi-rocket launcher that could turn an entire area into fire within seconds. When a full battery unleashed its rockets, the ground shook, the sky glowed red, and whole positions disappeared under a storm of explosions. German troops, unable to predict or withstand its sudden barrages, gave it a name they never forgot, Organ of Stalin tonight. You'll follow the creation of this weapon from its earliest concept to the moment its terrifying voice echoed across the Eastern Front. Stay close, the Katyusha does not whisper. It screams. Factories across the Soviet Union changed quickly in the late 1930s. Buildings that once produced farming tools now hammered steel plates for armored cars. Warehouses that stored grain turned into research halls filled with fumes from engines and chemicals. The country sensed danger on every border, and every workshop carried the weight of a future war that had not yet begun. Inside this restless environment, a young engineer named Georgy Langmik walked through long corridors lit by dim bulbs, carrying pages filled with numbers, rocket diagrams, and notes written during sleepless nights. Langmik had a quiet appearance, but the ideas he pushed were anything but small. He studied older experiments from the early years of the century, when rockets were little more than fireworks scaled up for military imagination. Those designs were too unstable, too weak, too unreliable. He wanted something stronger, something that could travel far, burn steady, and deliver enough force to shake a battlefield. His team worked inside a large research facility near Moscow, a place filled with metal beams, racks of strange cylinders, and an ever-present smell of acetone, fuel, and hot iron. Many projects failed before they even left the test stand. Tanks ruptured, fuel overheated. Rockets spun wildly during early trials and slammed into trees beyond the testing field. But every failure carried a lesson. Throughout 1938 and 1939, the Soviet leadership demanded faster progress. Intelligence reports whispered that Germany was testing new weapons at breakneck pace. Rumors of powerful artillery, new armored divisions, and advanced aircraft only increased the pressure. Langmik knew the Red Army lacked something essential, a weapon that could hit fast, hit wide, and hit with overwhelming shock. Standard artillery was slow to set up and too vulnerable. Mortars had short reach. Conventional rockets existed only as unstable prototypes. His calculations suggested a rocket that could burn solid fuel in a controlled, even manner while keeping its direction through simple fins. It sounded almost modest, but turning theory into reality was a long path. Workshops filled with hammer noise and metal grinding blended into the background. As the engineers shaped steel tubes for the new rockets, workers heated metal until it glowed orange, placed it into clamps, and cut precise grooves for stabilizing fins. In another room, chemists mixed powders for the solid fuel core, measuring each portion carefully to avoid accidental ignition. Every step seemed straightforward on paper, yet small mistakes turned into violent surprises. One early batch exploded while workers loaded fuel into a casing, leaving scorch marks on the wall and scattering fragments across the floor. Luckily, no one stood close enough to be harmed, but the shock reminded everyone that this project could not tolerate carelessness. Despite all the setbacks, the team pushed forward. Their best results came late at night when the facility was quiet, and only a few engineers remained at their benches. Langmik often reviewed test logs under a single lamp while sounds of distant trains echoed across the industrial district. The city outside slept, unaware that inside these walls, a weapon was forming that could alter the course of war. Step by step, the rocket design improved. Stabilizing fins held better at high speed. The fuel mixture burned more evenly. Launch rails made of welded steel allowed the rockets to accelerate in a straight path, without veering off. By 1940, the design reached a point where small field trials could begin. A flat testing ground outside the city became the stage for these early attempts. Soldiers and engineers stood behind sandbags while a single rocket rested on a simple rail, pointing toward an empty field. When the ignition system sent sparks into the fuel core, a thick plume of smoke burst out, covering the launcher in white and gray. The rocket jumped forward, climbed into the air, and disappeared into a distant patch of dry earth. The impact left a crater big enough to swallow a wagon. Observers stared quietly as dust settled. The power was clear, but accuracy still needed work. More tests followed. Some rockets curved too early, drifting off target. Some burned too fast, falling short. Others flew perfectly straight and landed with frightening force. Every trial provided new information. Langmik collected shattered fragments and twisted fins from the debris field, taking them back to the workshop to study each flaw. Adjustments continued through that entire year. shaping a rocket that could be mass-produced and survive rough handling at the front. Yet not everything depended on engineering skill. The political climate inside the Soviet Union grew darker around this time. Accusations spread through institutions, and many specialists faced suspicion. Langmuck eventually fell under the shadow. Before he could witness the final stages of the project, he was removed from his position and later executed during the purges. His absence left the team shaken, but the work did not stop. The rocket program had already gained momentum, and wartime necessity pushed it forward without pause. By the start of 1941, the first complete set of multi-rail launchers was built. These platforms looked crude, long rails fixed onto a frame supported by heavy metal beams. But when loaded, they held several rockets at once, allowing a strike powerful enough to blanket a wide area. Engineers rolled the prototype out onto the field for a full demonstration. The launchers stood in a row, angled upward. Smoke drifted lightly over the ground as technicians prepared firing circuits. Everyone understood that this moment represented years of labor, many failures, and the ambition to build something the Red Army had never possessed. When the test began, the sound was unlike anything the officials expected. A rising howl tore through the air as multiple rockets ignited together. The pressure shook the ground beneath the observers' boots. Trails of smoke streaked across the sky, arcing toward the far end of the plane. A series of explosions erupted in rapid succession, throwing dirt upward in tall columns. The entire demonstration lasted only seconds, yet the destruction covered a stretch of land wider than a city block. This success marked the beginning of a new chapter. The Soviet Union had a weapon that did not behave like artillery or mortars. It delivered fire in overwhelming bursts. It created shock and confusion. It turned silence into chaos instantly. But the world outside the test field soon changed. In June of 1941, Germany launched its invasion of the Soviet Union. The Red Army faced a disaster that unfolded across hundreds of kilometers. The rocket launcher, still rough, still untested in real combat, was rushed from the workshop to the battlefield. The first months of the German invasion in June of 1941 changed the Soviet Union faster than any engineer or commander expected. Villages burned, armored divisions rolled across highways, and entire Soviet armies collapsed under the weight of the blitzkrieg. News reached every factory and research site, pushing workers into longer shifts, harsher pressure, and a growing sense of desperation. The Red Army needed tools that could slow the German advance, and it needed them immediately. The rocket launcher that had just left the testing grounds became one of those tools. Even though it was still rough, heavy, and far from fully refined out in the workshops of Moscow, engineers worked beside soldiers for the first time. Metal frames lined the assembly halls, each one shaped into a launcher rail. Welders passed sparks along long seams, strengthening joints meant to survive rough transport over broken roads. New workers came from destroyed factories in the western regions, bringing stories of cities lost and units overrun. Their accounts reminded everyone that the weapon under construction might be one of the few things capable of shifting momentum. The atmosphere inside these halls mixed fear with urgency. Every mistake could cost time. Every hour lost meant another village falling to the advancing enemy. The launcher design went through changes as soon as the military inspected the first prototypes. Officers explained that the weapon had to be moved quickly, fired fast, and hidden before German artillery locked onto its position. The early rail frame mounted on a simple stand would be too slow. Engineers began attaching it to truck beds, starting with vehicles already in the military inventory. These trucks with long beds, strong suspension, and engines that could carry the heavy load. Workers cut extra support beams and bolted them into the frame, so the rails would not shake during transport. Reinforced clamps held the rocket steady, so they would not fall or break, while the truck crossed rough ground. Meanwhile, chemists continued refining the solid fuel mixture. The fuel needed to burn hot and steady, without sudden bursts that could spin a rocket off course. The earliest mixture produced too much smoke and burned unevenly, but adjustments to grain structure, oxidizing powders, and binding agents improved stability. By late summer of 1941, the rockets reached a level of reliability that satisfied the Red Army. They could be stored for longer periods, transported through heat or rain, and launched without the unpredictable failures that marked earlier trials. As the rockets and launchers became more reliable, the next challenge involved how to use them in battle. Traditional artillery units had fixed procedures, supply systems, and long-established doctrines. A weapon that unleashed a full barrage in seconds did not fit neatly into any existing category. Artillery commanders debated how to integrate this strange new system. Some thought it too unstable. Others believed its short-lived but overwhelming firepower could break formations in a way normal guns never could. Ultimately, the need for rapid response to German gains forced a decision. A special battery formed near Moscow, consisting entirely of the BM-13 rocket system. This group trained on open fields, studying how to drive into position, angle the launch rails, load the rockets, and escape quickly. The training area filled with smoke during these early drills. Rows of trucks rolled into place, each one adjusting its angle with small turns of the wheels. Crews worked together to slide rockets into the rails and secure them with clamps. Firing circuits were installed under tarps to protect them from light rain. When the moment came to launch, the sound rose into the air with shocking intensity. Even the soldiers standing a safe distance away felt the pressure in their chest. The trucks rocked back slightly from the force of the ignition, and the sky filled with long trails of smoke that drifted sideways in the wind. The impact on the field far beyond produced clouds of dirt that rose like giant pillars. Each crew wrote down the timing and sequence, evaluating how quickly they could fire and withdraw. As the German army pushed closer to Moscow in autumn of 1941, the first rocket units received orders to move west. Convoys carrying the launchers rumbled down roads filled with refugees, wounded soldiers, and burning wreckage. Drivers navigated around craters and damaged bridges. The atmosphere was tense. No one knew if the rockets would make any real difference once they reached the front. Many of the crew members had never seen actual combat. Their experience consisted only of drills and controlled tests. But uncertainty did not stop them. Every kilometer traveled brought them closer to the place where theory would meet reality. Even while the launchers moved toward the battlefield, other factories across the Soviet Union ramped up production. Plants in the Ural region, far from the advancing front, received orders to begin building more rockets and launchers. Engineers sent new blueprints, explaining simplified designs that required fewer rare metals and faster welding techniques. Cartons of fins, fuel grains, nozzles, and metal casings piled up in warehouses waiting to be assembled. Workers understood that speed mattered more than perfection. A launcher ready in a week, even if rough, was better than a perfect one delivered too late. By winter of 1941, enough launchers existed to form several full batteries. Each battery could release a wave of rockets powerful enough to tear open a section of enemy lines. But the crews needed more than power, they needed coordination. Officers trained them to move in tight formation, park in staggered rows, calculate angles using simple tables, and fire simultaneously. When multiple trucks unleashed a barrage together, the effect multiplied. Sound rolled across the fields like thunder. Smoke swallowed the launch sites. The area in front of the rockets became a storm of explosions that few enemy units could endure. As the units prepared for their first major deployment, tension grew among the soldiers. They understood that this weapon was different from anything used before. It created fear in a new way. It struck with overwhelming intensity instead of slow, sustained fire. If it worked as intended, it could change the rhythm of battle. If it failed, the crews would be exposed on open ground with no armor to protect them. The final preparations ended under gray, low clouds. Trucks lined up at the edge of the forest, engines idling quietly. The first real mission awaited them at a rail junction near Orsha, where German forces had dug in. The crews loaded rockets, checked angles, and waited for the order. The rail junction near Orsha became the first real battleground for the BM-13 rocket launcher, though no one on the Soviet side felt fully prepared. It was early July of 1941, and the fields around the town were already marked by tank tracks, shattered crates, and the remains of supply wagons abandoned during the retreat. German forces had taken positions along a ridge overlooking the rail line, using sandbags, dugouts, and machine gun nests to control the area. Their advance here threatened to cut another supply artery leading toward Smolensk, and the Red Army needed something strong enough to break their hold. The newly formed rocket battery received this responsibility, even though many of its crew members had never faced live enemy fire. Before dawn, the rocket trucks rolled into a thin layer of fog. The engines rumbled softly as drivers steered through narrow forest paths, each vehicle keeping distance to avoid collisions. The air smelled of wet leaves and fuel. The forest canopy muffled the outside world, but distant thunder-like sounds hinted at artillery duels already starting beyond the tree line. As the trucks reached a clearing, the crews parked in staggered rows and began the familiar routine of raising the launch rails. Everything felt strange out here. The drills no longer belonged to a controlled training ground. The same steps now carried weight, risk, and consequence. Crews moved quietly while sliding rockets into place. Each rocket, almost as long as a man's arm, felt heavier than usual because of the tension filling the air. The soldiers had been warned that once the trucks fired, the Germans would search aggressively for the launch site. The trucks were lightly built and offered no armor, so survival depended entirely on timing. If the crews stayed too long, counter-battery fire could fall on them within minutes. Everyone understood this unspoken truth. They needed to work fast, but they also needed to avoid mistakes that could misfire a rocket. Beyond the forest, the German ridge overlooked open fields. Soldiers on that high ground rested in trenches, unaware of the weapon pointed in their direction. They had faced artillery fire many times, and though they respected Soviet guns, they believed they could withstand most barrages. Mortars, field guns, and howitzers all had recognizable sounds. Crews on the ridge knew how to time incoming shells and how to take cover. But the weapon hidden in the woods did not behave like anything they had experienced before. It waited silently, unseen, and held a kind of power no one on the ridge could predict. As the sun rose, light spread across the low clouds, creating a pale glow over the landscape. Soviet spotters watched the ridge from hidden positions, noting where machine guns were placed and which trenches held reserve forces. When the final checks finished in the forest, the battery commanders signaled that the trucks were ready. A calm settled among the crews as they climbed into their positions. Despite the tension, there was a sense of unity. They had trained for this moment. They had watched rockets streak over open fields during trials. Now, the only difference lay in the targets. Beyond the trees stood real soldiers, real positions, and real consequences. The firing circuits hummed faintly as the crews activated them. The first spark touched the fuel core of the nearest rocket. What followed marked a turning point not only in the battle, but in modern warfare. A rising howl tore through the forest, sending birds into the air in frightened burst. The sound grew sharper and higher, as if the sky itself was being cut open. Then dozens of rockets ignited in near-perfect unison. The trucks trembled under the force. Flames shot from the rails. Thick white smoke poured out and wrapped around the launch sites. The combined noise drowned out every other sound on the battlefield dot above the tree line. Trails of smoke arced through the sky with terrifying speed. They formed long white lines that curved toward the German ridge before plunging downward. The first rocket struck near a machine gun nest, lifting a wave of dirt and debris high into the air. A second rocket exploded near the trench line, throwing wooden planks and helmets into a chaotic swirl. In the next seconds, the entire ridge disappeared under a rolling storm of explosions. The ground shook with continuous shock waves, each one arriving only moments after the last. German soldiers shouted, stumbled, and collapsed as the world around them turned into a field of fire. The explosions came too fast for anyone to move predictably. Trenches filled with smoke, equipment scattered, sandbags burst apart. Even those who escaped the first impacts felt disoriented. The rockets landed in sudden clusters, sometimes seconds apart, sometimes nearly overlapping. The psychological effect was immediate. Many troops froze in place, confused by the unfamiliar howl that preceded each burst. Some attempted to run, but quickly found no direction offered safety. The rocket barrage lasted less than half a minute, but the destruction it left behind stretched across the entire ridge. When the final explosion settled, the area resembled the aftermath of a natural disaster. Trees near the ridge had splintered into jagged remains. Trenches collapsed inward, burying equipment and bodies. Smoke rose in thick columns that drifted slowly across the rail line. The silence that followed felt unnatural, as if the battlefield itself paused to understand what had just happened. While chaos unfolded on the ridge, the rocket crews in the forest did not wait for the smoke to clear. They followed their training perfectly. As soon as the final rocket left the rails, drivers started their engines. The trucks backed out of position and turned down the forest path. The entire battery vanished from the clearing within minutes, leaving only faint tire tracks and drifting smoke. By the time German artillery attempted to return fire, the rocket crews were already several kilometers away. Reports from scouts soon confirmed the scale of the damage. The rocket barrage shattered the German defenses so completely that the Red Army launched a counterattack across the rail line with minimal resistance. Infantry advanced cautiously through craters and debris, still hearing the strange ringing left behind by the rocket howl. For many Soviet soldiers, this was the first time they saw the effects of the new weapon up close. The ridge told a story of sudden, overwhelming force. News of the weapon spread quickly through both armies. German troops began calling it the organ of Stalin, comparing its rising howl to the notes of a massive, horrifying instrument. Soviet soldiers, meanwhile, felt a surge of confidence. They had witnessed a new kind of power, something capable of shifting battles within seconds. Yet the Orsha attack also revealed weaknesses. Reloading took too long. The trucks remained vulnerable. Terrain affected their stability. The success at Orsha proved the rocket launcher's terrifying potential, but it also exposed its limits. After the barrage, commanders understood that the BM-13 could deliver enormous destruction but could not remain in one place for long. German counter-battery fire arrived quickly, and the simple stands used in early launchers forced the crews to spend too much time loading, firing, and escaping. In a fast-moving war, a weapon needed speed, not just power. The next step became clear. The rocket system had to move faster than the enemy's ability to react. This idea marked the beginning of one of the most important transformations in Soviet wartime engineering. During late summer and autumn of 1941, engineers returned to the workshops with a completely new assignment. Instead of thinking about the rocket as a static launcher, they were told to imagine it as a weapon that could travel across open fields, forest roads, city streets, and muddy fronts without losing stability. The frame had to be strong, the suspension had to absorb shocks, and the rockets needed to stay secure even when the trucks drove over uneven ground. This required a vehicle with enough power and durability to carry the heavy rails. Soviets' trucks served as the first platform, but soon, American-made Studebaker trucks arriving through Lend-Lease changed everything. These vehicles had stronger engines, smoother suspension, and longer beds, making them ideal for mounting multiple launch rails in tight formation. Inside the factories, workers cut thick metal beams for the truck-mounted frames. Welders reinforced every joint, creating a rigid skeleton that held the rails steady even during sudden acceleration. Fitters installed hydraulic supports that dropped from the truck bed to the ground during firing, preventing recoil from tipping the vehicle. A new firing system allowed the crew to ignite the rockets from a safer distance, using electric cables instead of manual fuses. Each improvement turned the launcher from a fragile experiment into a flexible battlefield weapon. At the same time, production of rockets increased dramatically. Workers shaped steel bodies on heavy presses, added stabilizing fins in long rows of welding stations, and filled casings with the improved solid fuel mixture. The smell of hot metal, fuel powder, and machine oil filled the air of every factory involved. Technicians inspected each rocket for cracks or deformations that could cause misfires. Thousands rolled off the assembly lines every month. Boxes stamped with dates and codes piled up in warehouses, waiting to be loaded onto trains for transport to the front. When the first fully mobile Katyusha batteries formed in early 1942, crews trained with new urgency. They practiced loading rockets while standing on truck beds, securing clamps, checking wiring, and lowering stabilizing supports. They learned to park in concealed positions, fire in coordinated salvos, and withdraw in seconds. Movement became as important as accuracy. A rocket truck that stayed too long in the open risked destruction from German guns or air strikes. Many crews memorized routes through forest, abandoned villages, and dry river beds so they could escape quickly after firing. The mobility of the new system brought immediate results. In battles near Vyazma, several rocket trucks rolled out from behind a hillside, unleashed a full salvo of rockets, and vanished before German spotters understood what happened. The explosions tore open trenches and threw entire dugouts into the air. By the time German artillery responded, the trucks were gone. This pattern repeated across multiple sectors. Crews learned to fire from unexpected angles, including forest clearings, narrow farm paths, and even frozen lakes during winter. As long as the vehicle remained stable during launch, the rockets could cut through the air with the same deadly force. Throughout 1942, Soviet commanders began using Katyusha batteries in concentrated groups. Dozens of trucks lined up in staggered rows, creating a wider firing arc. When all vehicles launched together, the sky turned into a maze of intersecting smoke trails. The ground trembled as hundreds of rockets exploded across enemy lines. This overwhelming effect shook German defenders and forced entire units to abandon positions, without waiting for infantry or tanks to engage them. Reports describe soldiers covering their ears and dropping to the ground, paralyzed by the shock and noise. Yet the new weapon also demanded new forms of protection. German pilots learned to search for fresh smoke trails and follow them back toward firing positions. Rocket trucks had thin armor and often lacked anti-aircraft support. To reduce risk, batteries moved under the cover of night or waited for cloudy weather when enemy aircraft struggled to spot them. Crews also hid their vehicles in barns, forest shelters, and abandoned industrial buildings. They camouflaged the launch rails with branches, tarps, and mud to blend with the landscape. Every detail mattered, because one well-aimed bomb or artillery strike could destroy an entire battery. Logistics also became a challenge. A full battery could fire more than 100 rockets in a single salvo, and each rocket required careful packing, transport, and unloading. Supply trucks followed the launch vehicles across long, damaged roads. Drivers often traveled at night to avoid detection. Workshops near the front repaired rails bent by sudden movements or damaged during rush withdrawal. Teams carried spare wiring, clamps, and support beams to fix small problems on the spot. The mobility that gave the Katyusha its power also created constant demand for fuel, parts, and maintenance. Despite these difficulties, the rocket truck became one of the most trusted weapons in the Red Army. It could punish enemy strongpoints, disrupt armored formations, and prepare ground for infantry advances. The crews developed unspoken coordination, passing tools, loading rockets, and moving trucks with practiced efficiency. Many soldiers believed the weapon carried both physical and psychological weight. Its scream had the power to break morale before the explosions even struck. German intelligence reports revealed growing anxiety among frontline units. Soldiers described nights filled with worry, never knowing when the next rocket storm might arrive. By early 1943, the Katyusha had found its identity. It was no longer a risky experiment tied to unstable ground platforms. It had become a weapon defined by motion, delivered by trucks that moved with purpose and vanished as quickly as they arrived. Its strength lay in speed and surprise. Its destructiveness came from the concentrated shock of dozens of rockets striking together. The Red Army now had a mobile firestorm capable of shaping entire battles. But the war still had far to go. The next challenges would be larger, bloodier, and more complex. Soon, the Katyusha would be called upon not just to disrupt enemy lines, but to help turn the tide of the entire Eastern Front. By the middle of 1943, the Katyusha had become more than a fast-moving launcher. It now acted as a signal that a Soviet offensive was about to begin. Wherever the trucks gathered, soldiers whispered about the scale of the coming attack. The rocket crews traveled from one sector to another, following orders that changed as quickly as the front itself. The war reached a point where the Red Army no longer fought only to survive. It began planning operations meant to retake lost ground and push the German army back. With every offensive, the Katyusha played a larger role, shaping the battlefield before the first infantrymen even stepped forward. One of the first major tests came around the time of the battle at Kursk. In the summer of 1943, the steppe stretched in open fields lined with trenches, barbed wire, and scattered tank traps. German armored forces prepared a massive assault intended to break Soviet defenses. The Red Army built deep layers of fortifications, but also staged rocket batteries behind the lines, hidden under netting and in low valleys. As German units moved forward, Soviet commanders released volleys of rockets designed to disrupt their timing. Crew members climbed onto the truck beds, loaded the long rails, and checked firing cables under a hot sun. When the barrage began, dozens of rockets streaked across the sky, leaving sharp trails of smoke that curled above the steppe. The ground shook under the explosions, forcing enemy tank crews to halt, regroup, or scatter. Even well-armored vehicles could not ignore the sudden firestorm that filled the horizon. After Kursk, the Red Army pushed westward. Towns that had lived under occupation for years saw Soviet soldiers return, and behind them came the familiar sound of the rocket trucks. Operations grew larger. The successes in 1943 encouraged the High Command to plan offensives across multiple fronts, each supported by rocket batteries. In some battles, the Katyusha acted as the opening hammer. In others, it filled gaps in artillery coverage, delivering fast and overwhelming strikes where regular guns struggled to reach. During the liberation of Smolensk, the rocket crews moved across forest roads that bent and twisted through thick trees. Trucks traveled in long columns, their wooden frames creaking over roots and mud. Supply vehicles followed closely, carrying crates of rockets packed in straw and wooden braces. When the units reached positions overlooking German holdouts, they prepared their rails and waited for the signal. The darkness before dawn gave them just enough cover. As the sky brightened, dozens of trucks fired in coordinated timing. The rockets landed along a defensive line filled with bunkers, trenches, and machine gun nests. The swarm of explosions tore open fortifications that had taken months to build. Infantry advanced quickly afterward, finding many defensive positions shattered or abandoned. The psychological impact of the Katyusha became even more noticeable during this period. German troops reported hearing the distinctive rising howl hours after the barrage ended, as if the noise carved itself into memory. Soldiers described feeling helpless when the sound began, because the rockets fell too fast to avoid. Even if they reached cover, the ground trembled so violently that soil collapsed from the walls of trenches. Some units withdrew early from positions when they spotted smoke trails rising from concealed launch sites. Others requested reinforcements before the barrage even began, believing the presence of the rocket trucks meant a large Soviet attack was coming. However, the rocket batteries faced their own difficulties as the Red Army pushed farther west. The more the front advanced, the longer supply lines became. Crates of rockets had to move through damaged railways, broken bridges, and muddy roads. Fuel shortages forced some launchers to wait for transport rather than drive themselves. Workshops struggled to repair broken suspension parts, bent rails, and aging electrical circuits. Even so, field mechanics worked day and night, pulling spare components from damaged vehicles and rebuilding trucks under open skies. Many rocket crews learned to fix their own rails with improvised tools, hammering bent supports back into place and replacing wiring damaged by rain or frost. Storms and seasonal changes added more challenges. In autumn, fields turned into mud that swallowed truck wheels up to their axles. Crews used wooden planks and chains to pull vehicles free. In winter, the metal of the launch rails froze, slowing loading times and stiffening the clamps that held each rocket. But the crews adapted. They heated tools over small fires, greased moving parts, and wrapped wiring in layers of cloth to prevent cracking. Every step made the trucks ready for another salvo. Because the pace of the war allowed no rest. In the summer of 1944, the Katyusha reached its peak during Operation Bagration, one of the largest offensives of the war. The Soviet plan aimed to crush the German Army Group Center, and rocket batteries gathered in enormous numbers. On the opening day, rockets filled the sky in waves that seemed endless. Smoke covered entire fields. The explosions rolled forward like moving thunder. German lines collapsed so quickly that entire divisions broke apart. Survivors described the moments before the assault as standing under a sky filled with shrieking trails, followed by a blast so continuous that it seemed to have no beginning or end. The offensive became a turning point, pushing German forces hundreds of kilometers backward and opening the road toward eastern Poland. Each success strengthened the reputation of the rocket crews. Infantrymen often waited for the Katyusha barrage before advancing. Tank commanders coordinated their thrust with rocket timing. Even regular artillery units used the sound of the rockets as a signal for when to begin firing. The battlefield became a coordinated machine of fire, shock, and rapid movement. Still, the strain on the rocket units increased. They traveled through territory filled with ruins, abandoned equipment, and deep craters. The trucks aged quickly under constant use. Crews slept in short intervals, sometimes inside the truck cabs, sometimes under them to stay warm. They ate on the move, repaired equipment in the dark, and learned to recognize enemy air threats before they appeared. The war pressed forward without pause, and the Katyusha moved with it, each barrage opening space for the Red Army to continue its advance. By late 1944, the weapon approached its greatest test. The final marches toward Germany required more coordination, more firepower, and more endurance than any previous operation. The rocket crews prepared for the last phase of the war, knowing the battles ahead would shape the outcome of the entire conflict. By the beginning of 1945, the war on the Eastern Front had changed completely. The Red Army no longer fought on its own soil. It now pushed across territory that German forces once believed impossible to lose. Towns, forest, and river crossings passed behind the Soviet advance in steady waves. With each movement forward, the Katyusha rocket batteries played the same role they had learned in earlier years: arrive quickly, strike hard, and create the shock needed to break enemy positions. But in this final stage of the war, the scale of their missions grew larger than ever before. The road to Berlin required enormous firepower, and the rocket crews understood that every barrage carried weight far beyond a single battlefield. Winter storms hit the region early that year, coating destroyed villages and broad open plains in layers of ice. Snow fell over damaged rooftops and abandoned vehicles, while Soviet units gathered along the Vistula River, preparing for one of the last major offensives of the war. The launchers moved into position during nights when the moonlight reflected off frozen ground. In pale silver streaks, crews covered the trucks with branches and sheets to hide them from enemy aircraft. The cold stiffened their hands and slowed the process of loading rockets into the rails. But the soldiers continued with quiet focus. They had traveled across hundreds of kilometers since 1941, and many crew members were veterans who had survived early battles, long nights of repairs, and countless retreats and advances behind the front lines. Supply trucks carried crates filled with rockets stacked in thick straw padding. Workers unloaded them and arranged them along the edges of the forest, where crews collected them one by one. The weight of each rocket felt heavier in the cold air. Tools clinked softly as clamps tightened and wires connected to firing circuits. The preparation moved with a calm rhythm built from years of experience. Every crew understood that mistakes now could cost valuable time during the offensive. German positions across the river included trenches, dugouts, and anti-tank guns, and strong points reinforced with concrete. Breaking through them would require a shock strong enough to overwhelm even well-prepared defenders. As dawn approached, the final preparations ended. The rocket trucks stood in long, curved lines that followed the natural shape of the forest edge. From above, the pattern created a wide arc capable of firing enormous salvos into the enemy defenses. When the offensive began, the sky lit up with hundreds of smoke trails rising in unison. The howl of the rockets echoed across frozen fields, bouncing between hills and spreading across valleys. The sound carried for kilometers, a rising pitch that grew sharper until the rockets vanished toward their targets. Moments later, the ground along the opposite riverbank erupted. Explosions cut through bunkers, smashed machine gun nests, and shook defensive lines. Waves of infantry moved forward behind this destruction, stepping into terrain still trembling from the barrage. The Vistula offensive launched the Red Army across Poland with a speed that surprised even its own commanders. Rocket batteries traveled behind the advance, moving from one firing zone to another. When German units attempted to form new defensive lines, the trucks parked on ridges and near ruined farmhouses, lowering their supports and releasing salvos that tore apart the positions. Many battles ended before they fully began. The psychological effect of the Katyusha intensified as the German army faced growing shortages and weakened morale. Soldiers who once held ground firmly now became uncertain. When they heard the distant howl of rockets, some retreated before the barrage arrived. Knowing the speed and scale of the attack left little room for survival, still, challenges remained. The rocket crews faced long nights repairing trucks damaged by constant movement. Tires burst on sharp debris scattered across old battlefields. Mud swallowed vehicles up to their axles when spring thaw arrived. Mechanics worked under dim lantern light to fix rails bent from rough travel and replace wiring soaked by freezing rain. Despite exhaustion, the crews stayed focused. The closer they came to Germany, the more they understood that their role shaped not just battles but the entire momentum toward the war's end. As Soviet forces approached the Oder River, the final barrier before Berlin, rocket batteries gathered once more in enormous numbers. This moment represented the beginning of the last great assault of the war. Launchers lined muddy fields, city outskirts, and forest clearings. Smoke from distant fires drifted across the area, mixing with fog rising from the river banks. German fortifications on the far side of the Oder spread across hills and ridgelines. Artillery, machine guns, and anti-tank crews prepared to hold the line. They knew the Red Army planned a massive push, and they expected heavy artillery fire. However, what arrived during the opening of the offensive exceeded anything they anticipated. When the order to fire came, the blast from the Katyusha batteries joined the thunder of conventional artillery. The sky filled with overlapping trails, each one curving toward the German lines. The explosions formed a continuous roar as they swept across fields and fortifications. Earth rose in towering plumes. Concrete bunkers cracked. Defensive trenches filled with smoke that drifted along the river like a low storm. This barrage opened the path to Berlin, where street fighting began soon after Soviet forces crossed the Oder. Inside the city, rocket trucks sometimes fired from behind destroyed buildings. Their rails angled upward toward clusters of remaining German strongpoints. Even in the tight, chaotic environment of an urban battlefield, the weapons remained effective. They cleared intersections, smashed barricades, and shook entire city blocks with concentrated fire. Crews moved quickly between damaged ruins to avoid counterattacks, using narrow streets and broken walls as cover. The smell of dust, fuel, and burn wood filled the air, mixing with smoke drifting from distant fires. As the final days of the war approached in May of 1945, the Katyusha delivered its last barrages against pockets of resistance inside the German capital. When the fighting ended, many rocket crews stood beside their trucks, exhausted, covered in dust, and aware that the long journey that had begun years earlier was finally over. The weapon that started as a fragile experimental launcher had helped shape the outcome of the biggest conflict in modern history. In the silence that followed the war, soldiers remembered the howl of the rockets long after they returned home. The sound became part of the story of victory, fear, destruction, and endurance. The men who built the weapon and the crews who fired it changed the nature of battle forever. A creation that began in workshops and test fields had grown into one of the most influential weapons of the 20th century, leaving a legacy that extended far beyond the ruins of Berlin.